Caption is sponsored by Law at the Margins and co-sponsored by the National Office of the National Lawyers Guild and CUNY Law School's CUNY School of Law. Law at the Margins is an online, innovative web platform that seeks to bring together lawyers, organizers, and activists committed to law and social justice. My name is Shamtoli Haq, and I'm an editor and attorney with Law at the Margins. You can check out a number of our articles and past programs on lawatthemargins.com. And also, this program is going to be live tweeted. You use the hashtag #LawAtTheMargins. We're really excited today to have an excellent group of panelists who've been committed to law and social justice to talk to us for this teach-in. So before I begin, just some logistics. For the registrants, we really want you to be engaged with this conversation. So on the right-hand side of the screen, there's a chat feature. Feel free to comment and use the chat feature throughout the discussion. The format will be that each of our panelists will present for 10 minutes, and then we will have a moderated Q&A. And I'll be observing each of the chats and your comments and also your tweets, and so that we can really have an engaged discussion. So let me go ahead and introduce you to each of our panelists today. The panelist we have is Ashley Woodard Henderson. She's an organizer with Concerned Citizens for Justice in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and it plays an active leadership role in the movement for Black lives in terms of strategy and also the national convening. She's also a board member of Highlander Education Research Center and a regional organizer for Project South. We also have Bill Quigley, who is a human rights lawyer and law professor at Loyola University in New Orleans. Bill has worked with social change organizations for a number of years, and I'm very honored to say someone who I consider a mentor in this work. Joining us from London, actually, I should have mentioned the locality. Maybe each of our panelists will do that. From London, via New Delhi, is Francesca Friuglio. She's a co-founder of Nazdeek. Nazdeek is a legal empowerment organization in India, and she's a human rights activist and researcher. She'll be talking about some of the clinical work they do in New Delhi, as well as their legal capacity work. We also have Parag Rajendra Kandahar, who is a founder of and a principal in Maryland, D.C. of Gilmore and Kandahar. Parag has been active around Baltimore activating solidarity economies and the field of community development work, and we'll be talking about solidarity economies. And finally, but not least, we have Colette Pichon Battle, who is a native of Louisiana and has been is the executive director of Gulf Coast Law and Policy. She serves as the executive director and has been working there around issues of climate change, and I understand has returned back from the climate change talks in Paris. So again, welcome to each of our exciting panelists. We're really looking forward to this conversation. The purpose of the teach-in is for us to understand the relationship of law and organizing. And this really program came about through conversations with young lawyers and organizers committed to social justice and wanting guidance and support as they do their work in the movement. And so this is really for each of you. So to begin, we're going to start with Bill. So as I mentioned, the format will be each panelist speaking for 10 minutes, and then we'll have a moderated Q&A. And again, I encourage our participants to live tweet at Law at Margins and use the chat feature for questions and comments. And before I hand it over to Bill, I want to give congratulations and thanks to Liz Newman from the CUNY School of Law, who is instrumental in sponsoring this, as well as Tracy Yoder and Pooja Gehi at the National Office of National Lawyers Guild. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Bill.
Great. Well, thank you very much, and I'm honored to be on this webinar with everyone. My name is Bill Quigley, and I'm in New Orleans, and I'm going to be the introductory speaker for this. Is it working out correctly? This is one of my first webinars, so I'm still new at it. So I was going to talk briefly about what community lawyering is and movement lawyering and how it differs from some of the other good work that we do. We all do a lot of good work. I see legal work, progressive legal work, divided into three different groups usually, and that is direct services, where we help people who really have individual needs. And this is very great and important work that all of us do, hopefully, at a pretty much on an ongoing basis. Direct services, usually legal services work and the like, very important work that we all do. Second is what I would call lawyering to change the law, or impact litigation, or cause lawyering, various names for that. And that's where lawyers get together and say, you know, we really need to change X law, and so we get together and try and figure out different legal theories to do that. And it seems to be very good work. I've been involved with that, and that's some of the work that we do in community lawyering or movement lawyering. Often, though, that is actually a lawsuit in search of a plaintiff, where the lawyers figure out what the important issues are and where the law could be changed, and then trying to find people who will be able to make that possible. The third category I would talk about, and I think we're going to talk about today, is movement lawyering. And that is where the lawyer is in a partnership with other people, usually people in an organization, trying to bring about social change, trying to bring about fighting for power, to take some of the power back from the people who have illegitimately taken it from the community. And one of the tests to figure out whether you're actually involved in community lawyering or not is, does the work of the lawyer help build the organization or movement? If the lawyer's work is helping to build an organization, then I think we are involved in movement lawyering. If it is lawyers on their own working at a computer, helping some individual or trying to figure out some intellectual thing, then that I think is more cause lawyering or impact litigation. These are all good things, but I don't think those other things are actually movement lawyering. So the test is really, does the lawyer's work help build power for people and an organization? Not just about changing an issue. In the work that I do and talking about it, I think that part of this comes out of your theory of social change. How do you think social change happens? And sometimes in law school there's this idea that social change happens because the lawyers went to court and brought a case and things changed. But if you really study social change and how it's happened for the women's movement, for civil rights movement, the labor movement, environmental movement, all the other movements that are out there, there are usually multiple points of attack in organizing and bringing about change. And I say that that's sometimes like the fingers on the hand. You can't really do anything with just one finger, but litigation is certainly one of the fingers on the hand and is involved in most social change movements. Organizing, though, is an equally important and sometimes more important finger on the hand, and so the litigation has to be in conjunction with the organization. Thirdly is education and outreach, community, helping people understand the issues and helping people understand what they can do about the issues. Fourth might be direct action, that people are actually involved, challenging directly the source of what's going on in another part of way to illustrate that. Another finger on the hand might be legislation, trying to advocate at the city or the state or the country level or the international level for some sort of change. So there are, in my experience, there's probably more fingers than 5 on the hand for social change, but if you look at and study social change, it usually involves all of those approaches. And so lawyers and legal advocates, if they're going to be involved in movement lawyering, if they are going to help organizations, if they're really going to partner in a respectful partnership with people who are trying to bring about change, have to realize that the role of the lawyer is one part of the overall approach, and that there has to be some accountability for that and the like. Um, and you're going to hear more about that, I'm sure, from the other people who are speaking. Recently, a young lawyer asked me, said, Bill, what skills do I need to learn in order to be a movement lawyer? Which I think is a great question. And this, I bought this online. Let me hold this up so you can see it. This is hopefully shows up as a Swiss Army knife. And Swiss Army knife is, as you can see, opens beer bottles in my case, saws off frozen vegetables, does various things as a corkscrew. But that we have to, as movement lawyers, we have to be flexible and be able to do whatever the situation needs. And so that might be defending a group who's been engaged in civil disobedience. It might be fundraising, helping people do fundraising things. I made a little list of things that I am involved with right now. So I'm doing an amicus brief for a group that is fighting to bring down the Confederate monuments in New Orleans. I'm helping draft a proposed ordinance for a group that's trying to take the money out of pretrial bail for nonviolent offenses in New Orleans. Helping another organization in another part of the country research and draft a human rights complaint that they want to bring both nationally and internationally to address welfare and child welfare issues in their community. I have been involved in a federal class action on trying to reinstitute some food stamp cutbacks that our governor, who was running for president temporarily, he cut out food stamps, and as an organization that made this litigation part of their organizing tool. And I am defending a group of people in civil disobedience as well. I made a little chart that I hope Albert can put up for me at this point of various tools that Shamtoli may be able to send out. I put down like 20 tools for movement lawyering, and it may be a little hard to see on the screen, but hopefully you can see that. But I just want to focus in the few minutes that I have left on a couple at the bottom. And that is that I think that it's absolutely important, particularly for white lawyers, particularly for North American lawyers, particularly for lawyers of various kinds of privilege, to make a conscious part of our action to combat institutional racism, white privilege, and the way that our legal system and all of the systems that we use hurt what we are doing. Lawyers can disempower organizations. Organizers have told me this on many occasions. They bring a group together, they get folks together interested in something, and somebody says, let's bring the lawyer in to talk with us. The lawyer comes into the meeting, and then they suggest, well, the lawyer will file suit. The lawyer files suit. They have a meeting about the suit, and there's so many people there. And they have another meeting about the suit, and there's fewer people there. And at the end, they may win or they may lose a lawsuit, but by the end, there's nobody there. So the way we have to fight this, understand the way that lawyers can disempower organizations, learn organizing, and learn how social change happens. Part of this is being uncomfortable. The role of a movement lawyer, community lawyer, is that we deal with a lot of chaos. We deal with a lot of personalities. We deal with people who don't have money. We deal with people who don't fit the sort of, they're not doing all their work on computers and email and that stuff. So there's a lot of things that we have to do. And then the last thing I think is to understand this idea of humility, understand respectful partnership. And I have on the back of my business card this quote that everybody is familiar with, which is the quote from the Australian Indigenous organization that put up outside their community center, which is, if you've come to help me, you're wasting your time. And I first time I saw that, I was really pretty upset about that, because I think of myself as a helper. But if you've come to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us struggle together. And that's, I think, the privilege that we have as lawyers working in this, is that we have something to give, but we have a lot to get as well. And I know the other speakers will be talking about that. So I'm going to stop there. I can't hear you, Shamtoli. I don't know if anybody else can hear you.
No, neither I can.
Thank you, Francesca.
Okay, now yes. Hi. Just one question for you before we go ahead. Shall we? Because I'm reading a lot of comments on the right section about folks not hearing the audio.
Yeah,
So I was
we're
just
working
wondering
on
whether you want to go ahead
it. Go
anyways.
ahead. It's recording, so don't worry, because
Okay,
if there's
sure.
technical issues, people can watch the recording.
Okay, sure. Well, thank you very much for inviting me today, and I'm very glad to have heard Bill's introduction because I think it really sets the stage for a lot of what will be discussed and for what I was hoping to bring to the table. So I'm one of the co-founders of NASDIQ, which is a legal empowerment organization based in Delhi in India. We work at the moment in Delhi, in a couple of slum areas, and in the northeast of the country in a state called Assam, which is the largest tea growing area in the world. And it produces about 1/6 of the whole the whole tea production of the world. Now, why I'm talking about this is because in the past 3 years we have engaged with tea workers in these plantations. There's about 2.5 million families living on the gardens, on the tea gardens in Assam, and the level of worker exploitation is extremely high. Workers are All workers on all plantations are paid much below the legal minimum wage, and they are in a state of generational servitude because they were brought to work in the gardens during the British colonialism, and the situation has remained pretty much untouched until today. So I think this scenario, although it definitely sounds extreme and very serious, is however very it is very common in the global south, and I'm talking about a country like India, but I'm sure in many other countries we can witness cases of serious human rights violations conducted by companies and by the business sector, with governments or states not being able to fight back. And this is an extra consideration that we need to keep in mind when we talk about movement building and lawyers supporting movements in the global south, that we are very often facing very strong power dynamics that are not only the ones entrenched in the society, like the caste system or like in India, but there's also economic power that comes into play. And with with the case of Assam, as well as with the case of larger India and other countries, the the level of poverty and economic exploitation make it so people have very little agency. And I'm going to introduce the concept of agency because I think it's very essential to understand what can lawyers do and where lawyers should tackle the issue from. Um, agency Agency affects marginalization and vice versa, and in turns the ability of people to seek redressal in the law and to see the law as something that can actually protect them as opposed to harm them, and being an instrument for oppression. The very first point that we need to keep in mind as advocates is that we need to spend a lot of time in ensuring people perceive themselves as right holders and not and as citizens and as part of a country and as part of a system, and not just as exploited people. And once the kind of the rights framework to the issues that they face comes in, and that is where we can talk about mobilization and collectivization of issues. But very often in the context of the global south, that very knowledge of of being a citizen with rights and with entitlements is completely absent. So I think the first, idea that we need to keep in mind is this, and is the lack of agency or the very poor level of rights awareness. The second stage then is about collectivization and ensuring that people understand that as marginalized communities and individuals, their power and their strength is collective organizing. And once a movement is created, or at least once there is a collectivization of a human rights violation of a problem, then is when we can start adding the added value of the law, or begin about talking or begin about looking at existing remedies and channels. Because if we don't have people participation and people and if we don't make sure that people understand what the process looks like, then we are going to inevitably hijack the history and of the movement and the demands of the movements, and that movement is going to fail. In the case of Assam, we've been working there for about 3 years now in partner with local groups who are mainly Adivasi-led, Adivasi meaning indigenous led, and so we have initially come in as a legal resource and trained their staff on legal literacy, on basic human rights law, and trying to really make the law relevant to people, and really to bring down the constitutional entitlements, for example, related to health and food and labor standards, in a way that it resonates with people's minds. And secondly, after we have kind of helped set up a group of paralegals who are community members or activists or grassroots activists who are equipped with the adequate knowledge and skills to be able to identify and document violations that happen in tea gardens. And once that has been created, then we have a sense of being able to monitor what happens in the garden, or at least have a sense or a way to report some of the violations that people face. And now those people are able to perceive violations as human rights issues. And can you hear me fine? I can't hear anyone.
Yes.
Okay, sorry. So following this, we have started to look up at what is potentially available in terms of remedies, and that encompass both kind of more grassroots or lower level channels like labor courts or administrative complaints, to higher level litigation. And international mechanisms as well, and the focus of really, so NASD comes in as a legal resource, as I said, because the main point is that the local groups need to drive the agenda, right? So we are going to provide counseling, to provide research, to provide legal support to whatever the groups decide is important to them to pursue, and whatever they feel should be on the agenda, and whatever they feel their demand should look like. So the first demand was about understanding the technicalities around the wage structure, and because the wage of the tea workers follows a collective bargaining process, which is very unfair and undemocratic. But unfortunately, that's the way it's set up. It's in the law at the moment. So we have conducted a lot of research on the difference between minimum wage, living wage, legal wage, and so on, and helped the groups come up with a study that has both economic and legal validity, and is able to inform their demands. So after that, they have set their demand for a living wage of 330 rupees a day, which is about uh, twice as much as the current wage, and that demand has started to be pushed through a number of channels and through a number of strategies, some of which are something that Bill mentioned earlier. So we have had, large-scale mobilizations of workers across the gardens. We have started to have representations or legal notes being filed and being submitted to local authorities at the state level and at the national level. And the local groups also opened a complaint with the World Bank Compliance Advisory Ombudsman Office, which is basically the like kind of redressal arm of the World Bank. And that complaint is still ongoing. Is going to close soon. But through that complaint, the case of Assam and the exploitation going on in the industry has reached international attention. And we have seen a lot of media coverage. Even very recently, the BBC has come for a fact-finding mission and has published a pretty extensive article and broadcasted on the radio, and that has brought a lot of attention from companies as well as from the government on this issue, and has given workers and the movement a huge leverage to fight back and to put their demands higher in the political agenda. Now, after about 2 years of campaign, we have seen an unprecedented increase in wages, though the wage is still below the legal minimum, and that's why the campaign will go ahead until when the demands will not be met. We have also seen the creation of a solid movement of workers that was not present earlier. And of course the conditions on the plantations are still very abysmal and very inadequate, but I think there is a much stronger understanding of how to go and how to challenge the situation. Now, the last point I want to make, which is something I know Chuntoli asked me to speak about, is also within these civil society-led efforts, we have also looked at the fact that there's very few pro bono lawyers that are active in Assam. Assam is a very rural area, it's not the capital city, it's not where the big law schools are, and it's not where students come to do human rights practice, right? So it's a very remote and isolated, and we thought that it was going to be extremely important to set up a law clinic in the local law school, and to make sure that local students are synced up with the realities that workers face. And this is both to break that kind of marginalization and that difference between workers and mainstream society, and also to make sure that law students are exposed to human rights violations in their own areas, and that they develop ways to seek redressal, not in ways that are relevant to people there. So something that we have learned is that there is a lot of more potential there could be from filing an administrative complaint rather than running to the Supreme Court in Delhi, which may come up with a very groundbreaking judgments, but then that judgment will not translate into any change for millions of people across the country. So my last point, and it's kind of an open question for everyone, is that I think we should reconsider what we mean with human rights lawyering. Is it about filing what I would call kind of boutique lawsuits at the Supreme Court to be the very fancy lawyer engaged on the fancy case that will bring policy level change, or is it about being on the front line and being at the grassroots and be side to side with workers, and maybe yes, maybe spending one day just trying to put together a complaint to be filed by post with with an administrative body, as opposed to to the lawsuit that we have been told to put together during law school. So I think a lot of consideration needs to be placed on some of these aspects, and I'm happy to answer questions at the end, and also I also want to hear what our speakers have to say. Thanks.
Great. So I want to invite Ashley now to share, which actually might be a nice segue from the rural areas of Assam to parts of organizing in the South. So Ashley.
Word. Thanks so much to Law at the Margins for pulling this together. Coming after Bill and Francesca, it feels like doing the benediction at church, and there's still so many other great speakers coming after. So I feel really blessed and honored to be one in the number. So my paid work is with an organization called Project South, the Institute for the Elimination of Poverty and Genocide. It's based in Atlanta, Georgia, and we do a lot of really powerful and amazing life-saving work, both locally in Atlanta, really highlighting the youth organizing work that happens with young Black people in South Atlanta. We do education and research work, so lots of really awesome work around building different curriculums, supporting leadership development, building a movement institutes, etc. And then my work is really getting to participate in the building of Southern infrastructure for the liberation of all people. We believe that as the South goes, so goes the nation, and so we broadly organize across front lines of struggle, whether it's environmental justice or racial justice, or visualizing the body as a front line and fighting for the liberation of LGBTQ plus people. Many other front lines of struggle. If it's happening in the South, it's indicative of us to be building movement around it. And so we get to participate in an outfit called the Southern Movement Assembly. We're the facilitative anchor, and that's basically organizations from across the South that come together to build movement infrastructure for the liberation of our people. This year, we're spending a lot of time really being intentional about building infrastructure around people power, to increase our opportunities for political education, movement education, and to build our opportunities to communicate internally to the region, but also starting to control our narrative externally. One of the other really wonderful pieces of the work that Project South has been lucky to participate in is the movement for Black Lives. And so folks, I'm sure, have heard many things about it. It's definitely organizations from all over the U.S. and really all over the diaspora of where Black bodies are living, working, and loving. We have been spending a lot of the last year trying to, again, you're going to hear me say the word infrastructure a lot because that's really where we're at. Is trying to make sure that we're building infrastructure for folks to be able to participate in movement sustainably, but not just as a hobby, literally as a lifestyle, and to make sure that we're doing the work that changes the material conditions of Black people. And so, I think when we're thinking about the movement for Black Lives or Southern organizing in the context of what it is to be an attorney, to want to be an attorney, to be a law student, to be a paralegal, etc., there's plenty of important questions to ask, and I think that Bill and Francesca have already named many of them. We also put up a piece on Law at the Margins called Real Talk to Movement Lawyers, and it's some basic stuff that if you're getting involved in movement, whether you're an attorney or any other sort of role that you might take in building movement, that you should consider. So 3 of them, for example, are like, where do you put down roots? Where do you decide that you're going to build a base? Where you're going to support people for the long haul, and being intentional about making sure that we're not coming into people's communities like we are the great saviors, but coming in to really do the work of supporting and serving folks in those communities. To identify what your role is in that community, and really stay in your lane, and know that sometimes that's going to mean it's really frustrating because people aren't listening to, you know, the academic brilliance that you have, and the strategies that you might think can work in terms of development of laws and policies that could liberate people, or ways to fight back against oppressive laws and policies, and making sure that we're building a community that can hold and sustain you as much as we need you to hold and sustain community. And then really being intentional about who you represent and what cases you should take on. I mean, I think it goes back to Francesca's point about like what is the strategic goal of the work that you're trying to build. You know, what we've noticed in the South is that it can be incredibly difficult to get you know, attorneys to give advice to, or to take up the cases of some of the most marginalized in our communities as clients. I think, you know, even in cases like Tamir Rice, right, where it's a 12-year-old child in Cleveland, Ohio, who clearly was not doing anything other than being a 12-year-old kid, that even then we've heard that there's been challenges in getting legal representation for cases very similar to that, because the case isn't, you know, squeaky clean by the press and the politician standards. And so I think it's really critical to be intentional about recognizing that one piece of being a movement attorney sometimes is taking the cases of the least of these in our community, whether it means that it's an easy win or not. So I think there's a lot of other questions to consider, but I think those are a few. I think in terms of things that I think it's important that the organizers and community folks know, is that, you know, at this point in time where our people, especially Black people, are under such an attack, right? We know that the Malcolm X grassroots movement has said that a Black person in the United States is murdered by a police officer, a security guard, or a vigilante every 28 hours. And what we know is it's probably more often than that. I think in a time where the attack is so big, that it's critical that we don't throw out any tactic, all right? We need to use all the tactics in our tactical toolbox. And that includes being, you know, really intentional about developing relationships with movement attorneys and law students and paralegals and all folks that are connected to that work, to make sure that we're developing the most sophisticated strategies to win, right? We want to win. We don't want to just do this work for the sake of doing it. And so in hopes of not throwing our people away, it's really important to make sure that we're building with great folks like you all on this webinar. I think the challenges are many, that our regions are so spread out that, you know, it's real that, you know, people that are getting into law practice have bills to pay, and we need movement to be able to support like literally the labor of attorneys. And so we need to continue to build that kind of infrastructure. And I think the challenge on the flip side for attorneys, and some folks have spoken to this already, is like, we've got to be able, as folks from academia, regardless of the field of study, but definitely from the law perspective, be able to say, hey, y'all, like, maybe I don't know everything. Maybe I don't have the best idea for everything that you need to do to get free, but I do have this particular expertise. And trust that the community is going to be like, okay, like, we actually do want you to share your expertise with us, even if we decide it's not the best strategy for us in this particular political moment. So being able to meet each other where we're at, I think is one of the challenges, but also our greatest opportunity, that we're going to be able to come up with some of the best strategies that we've seen in the 21st century because we're building the infrastructure to work together. You know, I think finally, in terms of where I'm seeing folks be really successful, I'm seeing a lot of really great relationships being built between movement people and folks that come, you know, movement people broadly, folks that don't have law degrees, but also the movement people that are involved that do have law degrees and are law students and are building, you know, practices to support people from that perspective. I think one of the examples that I've seen across the country has been folks getting really excited about participatory defense. I know that there's been a lot published lately about that particular area of work, and I've heard great things both from attorneys and from community members saying that this is one tactic that we could use to build the kind of relationships that we need between activist organizers and attorneys that actually lifts all boats. So I would encourage people to check that out. I think we've seen some really great stuff in the restorative justice movement in general, including participatory defense, but I would also throw out some of the amazing expungement clinics that have been bringing people together across racial divides. You know, I've heard really, really wonderful things about folks doing expungement clinics and DACA clinics at the same time. I think Colette has done that before. And it brings Black and brown bodies together to talk about the similarities of their struggles, while not just saying that it's all one big, homogenous struggle, because that's also not true. But it brings people together to talk about where they do have those similarities and to build movement strategy together from that space. I think we've seen some really amazing work from August of 2014 to now, of building rapid response infrastructure in the defense of people in times of great crisis. I think there's examples like Law for Black Lives, who has been amazing. Purvi Shah, I think, is maybe on the webinar, but who's been, all these amazing people who've been building the infrastructure of attorneys being able to talk to other attorneys about what it looks like to show up in the 21st century Black liberation movement, and really follow the leadership of folks most directly impacted, but really get out there and be on the front lines. If it makes sense for you to be on the front lines, and if it doesn't make sense for you to be on the front lines, to identify your role, so that if it makes sense for you to be helping us develop policy, that you do that and you play that role really well. I think we've also seen stuff like the Black Movement Law Project, and folks like Nicole Lee and Nash and other really amazing attorneys really step up to not only show up and be on the front lines for folks, but also to train and develop other attorneys who are interested in participating in the broader movement. So I would offer all of those best practices and examples as opportunities, and by no means are they the only ones, but I would offer them as opportunities to see how people are using best practices and building the relationships that we need between folks who are experts in law and folks who are experts in being movement actors and players and being out here on these front lines. I think there's a lot of really great work that we can do together, but we can only do it together by starting in spaces like this, where we can have real and deep and honest conversations about how we've fudged it up, and what we need to do to build the kind of infrastructure so that we can be the most successful and meet the sophistication of the state that is oppressing our people with the sophistication of our movements that are dynamic and beautiful. So again, really, really grateful to be in this space and looking forward to the Q&A.
Great. So I'm going to invite Colette at this moment to join in. And we have a couple of questions. I'm just going to flag them. And also, I realize that there's some sort of technical difficulties with the viewing and the feed, but our conversation is being recorded. So so we should just continue. But they do relate to Parag and Colette, which is conflicts between the client's obligation and lawyers' ethical obligations. And then, since you are in a nonprofit, the conflicts between nonprofit boards and movement demands. So I just wanted to flag those as things that we should think about, the questions that have come up in the chat.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for those questions, and thank you for having me on the call. Okay, I'll keep going. Yeah. My name is Colette Pichon Battle. I'm the Executive Director of the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy. We're located in Slidell, Louisiana, and we work in the Gulf South, which is Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida, with communities of color on the front line of climate change. And I wanted to just offer to this wonderful conversation a few points about, from the lawyering perspective, that address, I think, a little bit more of the infrastructure questions. One of the main pieces is just telling you a little bit about how we do our legal work connected to climate change, which is not often where people think legal work has big intersections. But the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy roots its work in the issue of climate change, and our vision and our mission derives from living through recovering from the 2005 hurricanes in the Gulf South, as well as the 2010 BP oil drilling disaster. Our legal work comes from working with communities and seeing what barriers that we actually anticipated. It was something that we were really hit over the head with, assuming that in a disaster like that, justice would prevail and laws would work, and watching over 10 years of recovery again and again, just who was marginalized and who was limited from recovery. I wanted to share that our work around climate change really sort of roots itself in climate-based disaster recovery. And it's an area that doesn't get talked about much in the climate movement, as folks really sort of talk about climate change as something that's going to happen to people one day, and what are we going to do about it through this policy. The reality in the Gulf South is that climate change is happening to us already, and what are we going to do to make sure that the things that are broken in the Gulf South are fixed before climate-based disasters hit more people in the United States and around the world. We've had some recent good work around climate justice, and you know, I was really excited to hear a shout out for our recent trip to Paris. The Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy anchored the Gulf South Rising initiative, which took over 30 frontline leaders, people of color mostly, to Paris for the UN climate talks. And that in itself was a great and wonderful feat. But the broader issue was really to introduce those leaders to aspects of international law that many of them were not even didn't know that they had access to utilize. We had delegates who were actually part of the witnessing of the negotiations, while other delegates were moving around the space in Paris to build relationships. At the end of the day, the work was to build policy here in the U.S., here in the Gulf South, starting from our states and working their way up through the U.S. political system, laws that will not only help us recover in the Gulf South, but understanding that the laws and campaigns that we push, they have to be connected to this broader global movement of the global South of climate justice. This was good work for us. It didn't require us to file a lawsuit. It didn't require us to get anybody out of jail. It did require us to stand with the community leaders and offer a little bit of information and expertise around international law and how to involve yourself in it. But it didn't require us to be the knowledge keepers, just the facilitators of that process. Ashley mentioned that some of the work of the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy is centered around our legal clinics. We offer legal clinics in partnership with legal services.
Oh.
Their community campaign, be clear on their community campaign, and to go forward with that community campaign in conjunction with legal services. And so what we often do, especially in the New Orleans, the greater New Orleans area, also in South Mississippi, is we have immigration clinics together with expungement clinics. At the same time that many Latino, Asian, and Black immigrants are walking into the space for help around immigration services, they are meeting, standing with, talking with African Americans and other people of color who have been marginalized and targeted by the system. An interesting example of this, we have these expungement clinics specifically targeted around folks who got a criminal record during Hurricane Katrina evacuation and recovery. You may not know, but there were a lot of folks who were arrested for theft, for stealing cars or stealing food, mostly as a means of actually getting out of harm's way or surviving. While at the end of the day, we all agree it was an egregious situation and folks had to do a lot of things that they didn't think they were going to do. So surviving on food or keeping your rental car out 4 days extra without calling the front office might be something that that would happen. A lot of these folks have criminal records now, and so and they are allowed to be expunged. So we hold the expungement clinics together with immigration clinic, specifically one around DACA or childhood arrivals to the U.S. Many of these children who are now growing up know only the United States and have every intention of engaging in an increasing civic participation, but they have to get their status straightened first. So the question is, what happens when you can get folks who are impaired by the same system? What happens when you get them into a room? And an even better question is, what happens when you get them into a room with a community organization with a goal of building a base and a campaign rooted in how we move in our legal clinics? And this is one way that we'd like to see the work continue around the Gulf South and the nation. I also wanted to share with you that we have had some legal success with just being sort of the mean lawyers in the room. Around the Katrina 10 commemorations last year, the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy worked with Native American and African and folks of African descent in New Orleans to reclaim the use of a public park. This public park is a holy ground for the Homa Nation, and it was also considered to be sacred space for African descendants in the greater New Orleans area. However, they were being told, both groups were being told, they couldn't use the park, which is actually public land. They couldn't use the park to have their own commemoration of Katrina. The role of the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy was really to follow the lead of the indigenous groups who wanted to use the park, but were being told they couldn't. We didn't have to use any legal avenues, but we did have to stand with the community and use our status as lawyers if a lawsuit was going to be needed, and to even threaten lawsuit if these folks were not able to use the park, which were public lands. We weren't the leader, but we were learning to follow. But we also at one point had to really be ready to play our position. And if our position at that time was to use legal maneuvers, we were ready to do so, but only when we got the green light from community leaders. So we worked with, during this whole process, we worked with community leadership to understand not just the issue that was ahead of them, the use of this public park, but also to have a broader conversation around structural issues and issues inside the climate movement that have to do with protecting public lands, and for our work, what we call land sovereignty. This is an opportunity not always to file a lawsuit, but sometimes to be a connector of information or even analyses, and this is some of the good work we've been able to do. So just personally, I've worked in various legal settings. Most folks don't know that prior to Katrina, I was actually in corporate law, and I just want to say it wasn't all bad. I worked in corporate law prior to returning home in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, and I made good money. I worked for a good firm. I worked for a good boss, and I had a good team of very smart folks working with me every day. It was a good gig. This is not how the progressive movement generally talks about corporate law, but I just wanted to give a shout out to the lawyers out there who go into law school and even into the legal profession with the best of intentions. I have to admit, if it weren't for the experience that I got in corporate law, I would not have understood what tools were actually out there that could support my community in recovery. The truth, although it is not one that I enjoy admitting, the truth is a lot of these corporate firms have access to analyses and tools and things that folks on the ground will never see. We end up needing to have some of this information and expertise, I think, for us to get stronger. So I'm grateful for that experience, and I just wanted to make sure that we knew that all private firms aren't bad. With that said, watching your community be demolished first by a storm and then by the structural discrimination of a long and extended recovery should force anybody to reconsider their role in the world, and that's what I did. I returned home and I opened my own solo practice. I didn't really know any other model other than, a for-profit law firm. I thought about the ACLU or the Southern Poverty Law Center models, but the aftermath of Katrina seemed to require something more, and I wasn't quite sure what that was going to be. Now I still have my solo practice actually, and I do some work in my community, very little, but some work in my community through that practice. Instead, I have been able to establish a nonprofit law firm and justice center, the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy, which has been a very fulfilling experience. While the firm experience didn't really seem connected to changing law, neither did the solo practice. My work with the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy, this public interest law firm and justice center, allows me to root myself in the injustices that I want to see changed and eradicated. So just a little bit more about some of the challenges. You know, working in a corporate firm, again, not all bad, especially when you have law school loans and things like that. But also, I want to say that not very fulfilling. The competition from law school carries into the firm, and the end goal of your time at a corporate firm is absolutely centered in ego and self. It didn't. As a solo practitioner, I also wasn't necessarily connected to changing the law, but I was at least connected more to the people that I love and who love me from my community. But the biggest challenge that I found as a solo practitioner, especially as a Black woman in the South, challenge with access to the capital needed to build up a firm, to be, there's a lack of access to the resources that make practicing in the firm very easy. Wasn't something that we're working harder and working alone. It really allowed me the freedom to connect our mission into changing the law. And hard for a community, however, that has been disempowered to see a lawyer as just a member of the team and not the coach of the team. So I just want to go back to the point that Bill underlined earlier, which is humility. I think it's a real skill if you're going to work at the community level, and something that you're going to need to perfect if you're choosing the public interest law route. The good news is that when you work in a public interest law firm or justice center like the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy, certainly if you're the executive director, you can build your own organizational culture rooted in the principles that build power and support positive change. Now, this is what we've been trying to do, which means our work is not just about the internal impact, but also not just about the external impact on the community, but about internally how we just change the landscape of lawyers and legal service providers. Finally, I just wanted to touch on balancing lawyering work with personal challenges and burnout. Just a few words to say, this work is not easy. Balancing lawyering is difficult, but at justice and law, which is not all legal cases in my opinion, you have access to the whole story. Oftentimes it's you that has to sit in front of a person who is in trouble, whose family is in jail, whose loved one has been murdered, and you take that home every day. When people give you that emotion along with the story, along with the facts, you have to figure out a way to really balance that, and it's important that you do. I think will serve you well here. Often when people share interesting or personal things with me, I just say thank you. Thank you for sharing that, because it's not easy for people to admit that they've been beaten or that they've had some sort of trauma. And they've just trusted you, and you should honor that trust. I also think another tool that you need are a crew of friends who will just pull you away from the work sometimes, pull you away from the questions of justice and equity every now and again. Not because it's not at the center of who you are, but because sometimes we have to come up from these deep dives in law, and we'll be better for it. Be sure to build that circle of friends for yourself, and make sure that they're not a lot like you. Make sure that if you're a lawyer type, that you have some engineering friends or some organizer friends with great afros, or something that can help pull you away from where you have to sit for so long. It actually makes you a better lawyer to understand different perspectives. Thinker. Also, becoming a better strategic thinker requires a tool to just set for yourself, which is time for reflection and writing. Sometimes you need to just purge some of the experiences that you have. It's heart-wrenching work. Also, though, I think the truth about what's going on in this legal system. Many of us went to law school assuming that law was absolutely connected to justice. But as we go into this work, we learn that justice is often missing, and I think it's our job as attorneys to write about these experiences that we're having with an effort to, or with an eye towards shifting the system a little bit. So I would offer those tools just as we think about how to balance the rest of the conversation and the comments that are coming. And thanks again to these great panelists for a good conversation.
Bring in Parag to the conversation, and I've been jotting down the questions from participants. Unfortunately, because of the platform technical difficulties, they're not able to view. It is complex. Who's the client? Who's the lawyer? If we give the community's efforts to practice, are we doing an unauthorized practice of law? Then there's a grouping of questions around agency, who controls the narrative, how can you as a lawyer, given the balance of power, not sort of quote unquote take over? I think those are questions maybe really great for Ashley and Francesca. There are a couple of more, but again, I want to just flag those questions for each of you to think about that have come from the participants and Parag. And I think there's been a couple of questions about nonprofits, nonprofit boards, and when there's a conflict between nonprofit boards and movement work, and how do you navigate that when you're within a nonprofit? And I pose that to you because I know that you've been doing some thinking about that. But great, so Parag.
Thank you, Shamtole, and thank you for inviting me. And it's really a pleasure to hear such wonderful folks with such diverse backgrounds and experience. So I am super happy to be here. I'll try to get to the question on nonprofits. I definitely have an opinion, and I think that everybody else probably has an opinion too on that. So I'm here with Gilmore Kandar LLC, which is a law firm that we founded in 2015, focused on legal, policy, and advocacy tools to advance economic justice, racial equity, and social transformation. My partner, Dorcas Gilmore, and I view this practice as an expressly political project. To the outsider, we might be dismissed as transactional lawyers, but we believe in transformation, not just transactions. We believe that the distinction and the lines between litigation and transaction are a false binary, particularly because in the context of movement lawyering, as we're talking about today. So I take as a point of departure in terms of what my work is and what guides me from my mentor, Professor Susan Bennett's term of long-haul lawyering, in partnership with communities to address systemic and sometimes complicated problems and challenges. We do this to help folks build institutions that radically shift access, sometimes deemed as ownership, but I do find myself sort of questioning the notion of private property now. Agency, which we've heard folks talk about already, which is often sometimes called power, but I'm also questioning whether centralized power is the ultimate goal of organizing. And the liberty to exercise one's own and collective self-determination in a pluralistic society. So from the few and the elite, and who have those privileges, to the many in the public. So those are some of our goals and some of my goals in terms of this work. So we support community-led and community-driven campaigns and organizing efforts by supporting communities to build their own institutions, their own grassroots groups, their own nonprofits, if necessary, community-owned and collectively owned enterprises, and a whole range of things that kind of fit somewhere in between and in the gray spots and beautiful sort of spectrum between all of that. We don't often litigate ourselves, but we help communities to build organizations and economic independence for their ideas. Sometimes we help to translate the work of, and specialization of other lawyers, and even help to coordinate their services on behalf of client communities or groups. In other words, we sometimes play the role of general counsel to the community by using our training and skills as community lawyers, as community economic development practitioners, and as solidarity economy lawyers. So I often tell grassroots groups and economic projects that I work with that big corporations don't ask their lawyers if something is legal or possible. They tell them to make it possible. So while we recognize that there are critical limits to what change is possible through the law, limited imagination and arbitrariness of the law should not be a barrier that holds communities back to creating a more just world. So just because something hasn't been done before doesn't mean that it can't be done. And legal work can and should take its cue from the innovation that's happening in the community and with organizing every day. There's no formula to revolution, is one of the things that I've heard folks say. It'll be different today than it'll be tomorrow. It'll require different skills and different courage, different technicians, but behind the people and behind the people's sort of movements. And that's very much sort of where we come from with our work, doing this work to help to build some of the infrastructures that we've also heard and that Ashley mentioned too. But it always has to be led by the people as well. That's the way that we look at it, and the way that I look at it. This thing of the solidarity economy. So there's been a lot of discussion lately about the sharing economy over the past few years. Don't quite know what that means, but there's been a lot of folks who've mentioned it. Without getting lost in the weeds, the solidarity economy requires us to think about how oppression and exploitation are not natural or unavoidable, and they're also not by accident. So it requires us to take a systems approach to economic and social inequity, recognize that fighting for individual or even collective rights in a system that's built on exploitation is like playing whack-a-mole for justice. For example, you might finally win a victory for fair wages here, but then corporations move production and jobs overseas, where workers without even our limited protections are exploited. You might fight for ending fossil fuel extraction in your area, your region, but it's still being burned in factories that affect urban communities or new forms of extraction that hit other communities. You might take out a loan for capital improvement in your nonprofit or receive a grant from a foundation, and you're paying or benefiting from the same financial institutions and instruments that brought us housing segregation, redlining, predatory loans, the mortgage crisis, and the ever-widening racial wealth gap. So does that mean that we do nothing? No. Our community partners and the people who are organizing to end social inequity, economic injustice, and extractive finance and industry are clear that the current system is not working for them or for their constituencies. So they challenge us as solidarity economy lawyers to think outside of the conservative framing of the law. They challenge us to re-envision the law as a barrier rather than as a ladder to justice, and one that also requires the right tools to facilitate safe passage for communities. So the law is often created to protect the interests of the few, the property holder. We should question the very things that we study in law school, such as the enclosure of private property, the valorization of the adversarial process, and the notion of individual rights over collective rights. I think that the folks who are, the panelists here for certain, and then I'm sure a lot of the folks who are listening, that these are not, new concepts for people. But how do we think about this, and how do we think about this, in connection to the community work that's happening out there? And often that work is, far beyond, some of the discussions that are happening at lawyers' lunch tables. So they challenge our communities that we work with, challenge us to think bigger, to think about alternatives, and through this kind of practice, we try to take up their challenge. Frankly, we try to keep up with them while we're adhering to our ethical obligations, which some folks have asked about, to not actively advise them to break the law, nor compromise our obligations to maintain the interests of our client, whatever that means. But as a community, if the client is your community, or is the community, who is the community, right? And that is a key question that we always have to ask ourselves. If we're movement lawyers and we're working, for the community, with the community, who's the community? And what's that tension between, a leadership that the community itself has picked, or between people who consider themselves the leaders, and what's our role as lawyers in all of that? So that's one of the things that we have to constantly ask ourselves. And I think one of the articles that was posted, you could be working with an incredible tenant association that is working, on behalf of tenants. But what about all of the tenants who aren't organized, who aren't in that building, who are also who are paying out of pocket and not subsidized, for example? What about them? So we can be critical of the legal system, but we also are still considered officers of the court. So for community lawyers, our licenses are one of the things that we actually offer to the movement. So how do we maintain that balance, and how do we think about what we can do in service of the community, without losing our licenses? I mean, there's a line there, and some people are more comfortable with that line than others. I guess what we're focused on is recognizing that a rights framework or a rights-based framework is necessary to put the brakes on sort of the relentless violence that the regular people who aren't part of the 1% face. But we're also trying to work with communities to help build the alternative. And so in the questions I asked before around you take a loan, or you borrow money, or you get a grant, or you participate in an extractive and violent economy. The folks that we're working with are thinking about ways in which we can revisit some ways that people have done things for generations, as well as maybe co-create some new things that allow for more direct exchange between folks. And so sometimes our role is actually while community members themselves are actually kind of engaged with these questions and also very aware of the challenges that they face. Sometimes what's helpful is to be able to present through our access and through our information that we can gather other models that have worked in other places, or other ways in which people have organized themselves. Not to present that this is how communities should organize, but to show other possibilities, and that's one of the things that we try to do. So we see our role, my role, as a solidarity economy lawyer, or as a community lawyer sometimes, is to learn about some of the models that are out there and offer them when asked, to the communities as examples. So for example, it's incredibly helpful to learn from Dr. Jessica Gordon-Nembhart's research that cooperative economics have been a part of the African American experience in the United States from the beginning, and that there's a strong parallel track of organizing for economic self-sufficiency alongside civil and political rights struggles. It's just not as it's not as talked about, as discussed, the same way. It's helpful to know that in the Kurdish Rojava region in northwestern Syria, there's a vast social experiment underway that's building a society without a central state government, with more direct democracy that collects local to regional, that's explicitly challenging patriarchy, capitalism, and authoritarianism all at once, while battling ISIS. The workers have taken over hundreds of factories and compelled the government of Argentina to help them to own and control them. That cities across the United States are investigating and investing in community wealth building strategies, like community land trusts, worker-owned cooperatives, development, and other initiatives that can bridge the challenges that many people face. So, people are looking for alternatives, and people are creating alternatives, and they're also looking for, ways to think outside of what we're allowed to do. And that's also one of the ways to think about the law is, is the law liberating, or is the law something that's constricting? And that is also something I think that sometimes it's really hard for lawyers to think about that, but it's not hard for people in community to think about that, because they face that every day, And that's a challenge for us as movement lawyers, you know, to hear that and to listen. Because our training says the opposite often, you know, and I think being in community with other lawyers who think this way is incredibly helpful. You know, those supports are vital, and you know, because sometimes you feel really alone in that work. So I think briefly, kind of in closing, I just finished this novel by Rahinton Mystery called A Fine Balance, and in it, you know, there's a great quote near the end of the novel where he writes, one of the characters says, you know, law is a grim and unsmiling thing, but not justice, though. Justice is witty and whimsical, kind and caring. And that struck me so deeply because we talk often, and I think, you know, many of the folks who are here, you know, we talk about the difference in the gap, and we talked about it today, the gap between law and justice. But I think that, you know, how to define that and how to get past that, right? The you know, our nature, sort of my orientation to the law is similar to that. That, you know, the law is conservative, and it is conservatizing. And lawyers have to take great measures to remain vigilant to ensure that they don't simply replicate and guard the arbitrary lines that laws put between people and the land, people and one another, people on our higher and collective callings. So we work with the problem solvers and the innovators, you know, and we think about how things can be structured to support community brilliance and innovation. You know, it doesn't mean that, you know, I come up with some brilliant structure and that's going to be, you know, that's the solution. It's really like, what do folks want to do? What are their values and vision? And then what, you know, what might fit that, or where could that be, where it'll be not, you know, overly regulated or sort of controlled by the state, right? And so that's part of what we say our work is doing. And you know, we also think about information. You know, I think that you know, Bill mentioned these important pieces about, you know, really sharing the information, and information, you know, knowledge and information should be free. And so that you know, the information that we have access to as lawyers, you know, what are the ways in which we can make that as accessible as possible? We have access to networks, we have access to all kinds of things that we could make, you know, more openly and clearly open. I mean, out there to the people who are organizing. So I guess, you know, I remember from Ashley's piece, she had mentioned, you know, that listen as an important part, and so, you know, I think that we're, you know, when we're listening, and a good lawyer listens, you know, much more than a good lawyer speaks. I think a good community lawyer, and so you know, we often have to swallow our pride and learn from children, learn from organizers, you know, who don't have the formal education, grandmas, a whole range of different folks who know that good ideas can come from anyone, and often do when we create, you know, when we help to co-create, or we facilitate, or we are just in the room where they're actually, you know, able to fully participate. And if we can use our privilege to open that up, then that is a good use of the privilege that we have. So yeah, I did not touch the nonprofit question, but we do end up working with a lot of folks who are asking that question. You know, why not, you know, should we do a nonprofit? Should we not? I said at the beginning of my chat here that you know, we were explicit about why we formed this as a for-profit. And that we have, Dorcas Gilmore and myself, we have many years of experience in nonprofits. We think that, you know, nonprofits are vital in some ways, not all of them. And we also think that, you know, where the current regime that we live in, you know, we can be really strategic about the ways that we form and we formulate our spaces and community spaces. So, you know, on the liberal left, people talk about Citizens United as being this terrible thing. And it is, but we can also take full advantage of the fact that, you know, corporations and companies that are for-profit have, you know, pretty much free political speech. So we're not regulated, right? And so in that way, community groups that are more vulnerable can use us as a mouthpiece, and we can say whatever we want. We're not beholden to anyone. And that is powerful. And when community members understand that, they can be powerful in that way, and they can have access to that power. You know, I think people talk about 501c4 organizations, you know, social welfare, political lobbying organizations as the way to create that kind of political speech. But, you know, we need more folks who can advise that that isn't the only way. And that's part of what we do as well. And so with nonprofit boards, that's like a whole other webinar. But it's a tough thing when you're in the middle of that. And personally, I think that everyone has a lot of input on that. I'd be happy to talk after, you know, based on sort of what my experience has been. But I think the innovation is what is super exciting. And, you know, we're seeing there's an incredible lawyer named Lydia Edwards out in Boston who, you know, she was talking about doing a workers' rights, case with 4 domestic workers, and, you know, in a business that was making a lot of money, and she said, you know, the wages that are owed are so great that I might just ask for the keys to the shop, you know, and then they can own the business as a settlement. And that is innovation, right? And obviously the clients would have to agree, but, you know, that, like, thinking creatively about you know, how we can how communities can win is really exciting. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much. So I think what we're going to do, we have 10 minutes left. It happens when you have a great group of panelists and discussion. So what I'm going to ask is Bill, for each, Bill to start to answer the ethical questions around who is the client, and then also projects that try to do know your rights and empower the community. Does that brush against unauthorized practice of law? And then I'm going to invite Ashley and then Francesca to talk about this idea that can really lawyers and organizers and communities work, since there's such an imbalance of power, and there's always going to be a potential for lawyers or those with greater power to control the narrative. We talked earlier about, you know, controlling the narrative and censoring communities, but is it really possible? That was a question. And then Colette and Parag, there were a grouping of questions around just allyship, working with other electoral spaces. And so what I would suggest is that each person sort of answer the questions and then make a concluding remark, so that it will be sort of 2 minutes each, and we'll end at 2. Okay, so let's start with Bill.
Great. On the ethical things, I would say 2 things. The unauthorized practice of law, I have never seen that really raised seriously, except when people are doing something where there's money involved. There's so many lawyers, they don't want most of our clients. They don't want most of the organizations that we work with. And so I find that know your rights things are often done very well by paralegals, by community organizers and the like, and the lawyer can be a great question, you know, answerer or that. But I don't see that as a big problem, although it has been raised occasionally. Secondly, I mean, the only ethical thing is if you are actually representing. There is nothing wrong with telling people what their rights are, as long as people are clear you're not a lawyer and you're going ahead and doing that. Second thing on the ethical responsibility to an individual versus the organization or the community. I find that that's usually raised by defense lawyers and people on the other side, that the law is built on individual rights in our legal system and our legal training and that, and the idea of community trumping individuals, community more important, the building of power of a community is alien to our understanding of law. My experience in that is that if there is transparency and if there are clear, it's worthwhile putting things in retainers if you're going to represent a group, and others folks saying that the decisions are made in group settings where at all possible. If it's a criminal thing and you have people going different ways, then you might have to get other kinds of people to do to participate and help. My final thought, just as a summary, is to those who are going to be watching this, thank you for doing it. I will tell you, as I think all the others will tell you, this is the most exciting work that a person can do, is to be involved with other people, fighting for justice and trying to make the world a better place. It's a really very satisfying work.
Great, Ashley.
Yeah, I mean, I think to the question of, like naming that there's an imbalance of power, right? Any of us with any academic background, including myself, have a level of privilege that some people that are leading movement in our communities don't have. But I think, I would flip it. What I think is really true is just because I have a privilege and a level of power doesn't mean that the people that are most directly impacted by the oppressions we're trying to dismantle are powerless. It's actually totally incorrect to think that. So what's real is, our level of expertise, in the communities that I come from, my people like sort of say that there's a calling on your life and put you out in the work to do that very thing. And so I would offer that, if you're going into the work to be a movement attorney, to be a community attorney, and to really support the most marginalized, to really value the level of power and expertise that those folks have, those most directly impacted people have, about the issues that we're facing. I think that what we offer is those of us that have had experiences either building movement on the organizing front or from the law and policy side, is that we're kind of multilingual, right? And that's the kind of power and privilege that we can bring into those spaces. And they don't want, like, communities don't want us to not share that for the sake of like dismantling our privilege. They want us to share where we have expertise, and then they want us to get out of the way and let them come up with the best strategies to liberate themselves. And so I think in terms of, is it possible, to exercise agency or to control a narrative, understanding that in these relationships between movement, most directly impacted people in our movements and folks with academic privilege, whether it's in law or anything else, I think it is possible. And I think that one of the reasons I know that is because of my relationship to Movement for Black Lives, because of my relationship to folks like Colette in the Gulf South, and really seeing how movement attorneys showed up and showed out for people, but those people really gave direction and held those attorneys accountable to, and everybody else to being accountable to the most directly impacted people. And so I think it's not necessarily a matter of you individually checking your own privilege, although I do think that's a responsibility that we should all take very seriously. I think even more than that, it's about having mechanisms in place, building infrastructure, so that we can collectively hold each other accountable to the work of getting free. And then I think, just to wrap it up in summary, I think the questions to be asking ourselves right now are what kind of power are we building, right? Is it power, more people power? Are we building towards community control of everything that impacts these people's lives? Are we divesting from things that oppress us and investing in things that support our people? And are we, while we're tearing down the systems that oppress us and using the tools and tactics that exist right now, are we also building these alternative institutions and formations and organizations that will literally lead to life-saving changes in this country and in this world? And so, I'm excited about continuing to build these sorts of spaces like Law at the Margins, where we can really move forward the work, because we have now some infrastructure to have these conversations and relationships that we can call on when the crisis is real, and get from rapid response crisis to long-term organizing for social justice. Thank you.
So Francesca, just answering and then some concluding kind of remarks or.
Yeah. So regarding the same question that Ashley covered about the power imbalances, there, I mean, as far as what we are seeing in contexts like India, where there's already huge disparities in the society, there is yes an immense gap between lawyers and clients and communities in a plural form, and I feel that gap is very difficult to fill because of the nature of the legal profession many times. And so that's why paralegals are there to fill that gap, to stand in the middle, to make sure that communities are, can stand on their feet in terms of deciding how to shape the agenda and how to shape their demands, and lawyers should perceive themselves not as power holding agencies but as tools for people to exert their rights. And I mean, I realize it's very different from what the university and the teaching education system tells us. But like, the point is not to win a case. The point is to make sure that the community members have, are able to exert their voice and to and to reach to their rights and then their entitlements. And that could mean that once a case is filed, you have to kind of stand back and wait for the community to disentangle certain issues or to decide which way to bring it ahead. And of course, that affects your success as a lawyer, but only if you measure success in terms of cases that you win, and you should actually measure such success in clients' satisfaction and realization. And I feel the last small points is there's a lot of talks within the pro bono community about how can a quality of pro bono lawyering be guaranteed when pro bono lawyers work for free basically, and whether introducing fees even in a way that is maybe shared across a community can help strengthen accountability. And there are examples of organizations around the world using paralegals and these paralegals being paid by community members, and that ensures more of an accountability or more of it definitely reduces the power imbalance. So that's something to think through. It might not be a solution for every context, but it's definitely why not? I think that's something that we can all consider.
I'm going to just ask Colette and Parag briefly to just make last-minute remarks, and then we're going to close today's teaching. Colette?
Hi. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, I see that we're over time, so I'll just keep mine brief. And I'll say that given everything that we've talked about communities that they come from, that we should always try to remember. And I want to just encourage folks to not just seek out the issues of justice and then bring your bodies to that place, but in fact to do the work to uncover the injustices that are happening in your communities and be the return on investment that your community would like to see. They don't just want us all to be wealthy individuals. Sometimes our communities are hoping from when we're very small that we're going to come back and help to change things for the better. So I just want to encourage movement lawyering, not just in those places over there, but close to home in those places where you are from, you are rooted, and you have a level of accountability already in place.
Great. So, Parag?
Well, thank you again. I guess, for me, it's just to say that, I think of the community as sort of the master architect and the engineer. And, I'm really happy to be, a contractor that kind of has a long-term engagement and fair wages. But along the way, and that's the way in which we're going to build an equitable future. Right, and those models are in development, and people are creating them. So it is incredible work, and it is really a joy to do this work. Thank you.
Great. So we are at time, and so I want to thank each of our panelists for participating today, and I want to thank the National Lawyers Guild and CUNY School of Law for co-sponsoring. I want to sort of thank also Albert Garcia for doing sort of the behind-the-scenes tech, and three of our law students, Ever Hanner, Dana Jones, and Val Merlina, for also working with us on this. And again, it's clear there are lots of issues. We're going to continue this conversation, and we hope that folks will look towards Law at the Margins as a place of a resource and support to the work that each of you are doing. So again, thank you so much for each of you, Francesca, Colette, Bill, Ashley, and Parag, for participating today, and also thanks to everyone for being patient. One thing is clear is that technology is actually not always reliable, and in fact, least reliable, and that's been displayed today. But what is the most loyal and reliable is people and communities, and each of you showed up, in 100% today, and I want to thank that, and that's a good reminder that as much as we innovate and think about sort of all of these technologies, at the heart of what we do is people. So thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle.